Hi there, everybody. It's your pal Cal here. I'm actually alone today, just kind of recording my first radio episode alone. I downloaded a free program called Audacity for my computer so I can tinker around with editing and kind of goofing around with these audio files and working on radio episodes all alone or with the help of Will or whoever else is willing to co-host the show. But today I'm taking a jab at my first episode on my own. And so what I went ahead and did was I had a conversation with Dave Owen, who is the chairman of a ballot initiative for the legalization of recreational cannabis. So we have quite a controversial topic this week. So what I want to go ahead and do right away is mention in the little disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed in this week's episode of the Harm Reduction Report do not reflect the views and opinions of the radio station or anyone affiliated with the radio station. They simply reflect the views of the two people speaking behind the microphone today, Dave and I. So keep that in mind. And I went ahead and I listened to our conversation again. I listened to the conversation I had with Dave, and I found myself agreeing with a lot of what he said. And so I'm honestly a little bit even reluctant to air the episode, but I think it's very important. I'm reluctant to air it just because of the stigma, the political climate in our region right now. And but like I said, it's very important. It's something that's happening here in our community right now. This ballot initiative is on its way. People are petitioning and getting signatures, and you can expect to see it on the upcoming ballot when it comes to voting here for our politics. So I think it's an important topic that we cover. But before I go ahead and get into the recording that I had with Dave, the conversation, I want to make sure that the audience knows. I want to be very careful to articulate the fact that I'm not condemning or condoning cannabis use. Like I said, you'll hear me agree a lot with Dave throughout the conversation, but I want to be very clear that I'm not condoning cannabis use. I think at one point in the episode, I mentioned that the biggest win in my mind, if recreational cannabis were to pass, the biggest win is that good people would no longer have to spend time behind bars for things like simple possession of cannabis or use of cannabis. And what that means is your sons and your daughters, your husband or wife, your family, your friends, any loved one, anyone close to you, and anyone not close to you in the community would no longer have to spend time behind bars because of cannabis use. And beyond that, they would no longer be labeled felons for things like cannabis use. And that, to me, is the biggest win in my mind. That is one of the biggest reasons that I support recreational cannabis. And then I also want to mention another wonderful side effect of legalization, full legalization. Dave will get into the bill and what the specifics of it are. But another big thing to consider here is the economic ramifications of cannabis legalization. I mean, instead of spending, I think Dave quoted it's $40,000 to $45,000 per year to hold inmates in a prison. So instead of expending that $45,000 per year on a cannabis user who is not violent and is otherwise law-abiding, but he or she used cannabis to land themselves in prison, we no longer have to spend that financial resource on them, and instead with recreational cannabis, the state will be profiting just so incredibly that take Colorado for example. They have done so much good with the tax revenue from their legalization, and Dave gets into the specific numbers. in during the conversation, and the numbers are phenomenal. I mean, if you ever hear anybody in politics talking about budget and saying, "Oh, we don't have enough money. We have a problem with budget here, budget there. We can't fix the roads. We can't fix the school. We don't have enough money for Medicaid. We don't have enough money for local, getting people off the streets. We don't have enough money for drug rehabilitation." Well, one side effect of legalizing cannabis is that we would have the money to do all those things. We would have the money to do whatever we wanted, to fix whatever social issue we have in the state. And to me, that's just a no-brainer. I mean, to me, that's something we ought to pursue. We ought to at least consider. This is something I want you guys to all consider, is that a lot of good can come out of this. And as I mentioned, beyond that, your sons, your daughters, your family members, they'll no longer be labeled felons for cannabis use. And, they'll be able to gain employment. Once you're labeled a felon, you can't gain employment. That's a very difficult task as a felon, to gain employment. And so then again, a side effect of that felon not being able to gain employment is that they can't contribute back to society, and society has to take care of them financially and in other ways. So passing this bill, like I said, I support this bill. That's why I support it. And passing this bill will help mitigate and eliminate those problems altogether, probably for the most part. So that's just something I want you all to consider. That's my disclaimer. So to touch on the point of, I'm not condoning cannabis use by any means. I think it's very important for me to stress that abstinence is always a very good solution. It's ideal. It's ideal in any case. Abstinence from any drug is the safest thing you can do. Abstinence from tobacco, abstinence from alcohol, abstinence from cannabis and heroin, anything. Abstinence from anything. Just because I support the legislation of legalizing cannabis does not mean that I condone the use. I don't want to see people smoking cigarettes. That's not good for you. I don't want to see people consuming cigarettes and getting lung cancer and stuff. But I also do not want to see it made illegal. I don't want to see people sit in jail for using cigarettes. You know what I mean? So that's kind of where I'm coming from with with my support of legalization. I want to draw an analogy. I want to draw a comparison here to sex education. When it comes to sex education, we encourage abstinence, right? And that's good. That's ideal. You can educate people and tell them that abstinence is the best bet. If you abstain from intercourse, especially as a teenager, you are going to avoid getting pregnant. You're going to avoid sexually transmitted diseases and infections, and abstinence is best. It's ideal. But we don't stop there with our education. We go on to acknowledge that that's unreasonable to expect that every single person is going to abstain entirely. And somebody who doesn't abstain isn't a bad person. They simply didn't abstain. And so what we do is we provide those people that are not going to abstain resources. We provide them with condoms. We provide them with, the birth control pill, the oral contraceptives, and stuff like that. We do what we can to make the world better for those people. We encourage abstinence, but we acknowledge that it's unrealistic that abstinence all across the board is going to occur. So that's my position there. I'm not condoning cannabis use. I know I've said it a million times already at the beginning of the episode, but I just want it to be clear that I'm not condoning it. I'm just simply trying to see this from the most objective standpoint that I can. I want to see, I believe that this will be a positive impact on our community, as it has been for other communities that have pursued this route of drug legislation. So with that being said, we'll just I'll play the recording here, and I think what I'm going to do throughout the recording is kind of pause it and add a little input in between statements that Dave and I make with one another. And I'll also kind of plug that little disclaimer in there throughout the episode, just so that, I don't expect everybody listening to the radio show to be listening it from the beginning to the end. So I'll reiterate that that disclaimer throughout the course of the radio episode. And it's funny, you can hear my reluctance, you can hear my apprehension to speak on this topic. It's an intimidating topic to speak on, especially from the stance of legalization. I'm sure that, I might encounter some backlash, and that's okay. I think that's okay. This is a topic that's right in our faces. It's been in our faces for years, and it's something that we need to address now. It's time to address it. So thanks. I'll turn it over to Dave and I guess, and here we go. Harm reduction includes abstinence abstinence
Right.
is always the safest bet. I mean, consider, sex education. I always like to make this analogy. When it comes to sex education, abstinence is safest. You're going to avoid pregnancy, you're going to avoid STDs, and this and that.
Yeah.
But that's unrealistic. You have to provide condoms. You have to provide the harm reduction materials. And
right. And I view marijuana as a harm reduction from meth. I view it as a harm reduction from heroin. I view it as a harm reduction from opioids. I even view it as less harmful than the prescription meds we got on. Like
exactly.
we were just at the bar with that man.
Yeah.
And he's a bongo player, and we'll keep his name out of it because we haven't talked to him and gotten his permission. But I see him struggling to grip a glass, and he says he has to go to the bar and have a couple drinks because it's the only thing that really helps it. All right, would you rather that man have a smoke or two in his apartment, or have 2 or 3 drinks and have to worry about how he's going to get home? Because thankfully we're in Grand Forks. There's Uber, there's taxis, there's an infrastructure. But what about in a small town? I hate to pick on Hillsborough, but it's the town I always go to because I have some family there. What about Hillsborough? All right, there isn't the network there to get that person home. And he's tried the pain pills, he's tried the opioids, they're not working. So what do we do for that guy? And I know that's more the medicinal realm, but even on the recreational realm, we've got people who want to unwind and want to relax and want to slow down and calm down. And the go-to for centuries was alcohol. I think the safer go-to is marijuana.
Right. Okay, sure, yeah.
But that's the core argument on harm reduction.
So Dave mentions this as the main point on harm reduction, and I think I have a better point on harm reduction. The reason that legal cannabis would be a harm reduction tactic is because you regulate the hands of the people that distribute the cannabis. You create a network of accountability. Take, for example, alcohol distributors. They have to ID the consumer. They have to ID the person making the purchase on alcohol. If there is a problem with the alcohol, say it wasn't brewed properly or distilled properly and somebody's getting sick, there are, the distillery, the people selling the alcohol are held accountable for that issue with the alcohol, with the product. So, the main point, the main harm reduction here is that dispensaries would be held accountable. There would be no fentanyl. There'd be no lacing drugs into the cannabis. And this is a big deal. I mean, it sounds like a very loose and liberal idea, but think about it. If your son or your daughter does decide to try cannabis against all advision, you advise them, don't do it, but say they do it. You want to be sure that there is no adulterant in that cannabis. You want to make sure that there's no fentanyl in there that will cause the immediate overdose. You want to make sure there's no, what else do they put in there? Like, what's it called? Phencyclidine, the PCP. Sometimes they lace it with PCP and stuff. As soon as you create that network of accountability, that kind of thing will no longer happen. Or if it does, somebody will certainly be held accountable. And that will be a huge incentive to make sure that this no longer happens. Oh, another perfect point is that these dispensaries will not be willing to sell to minors, right? Currently, a drug dealer is committing a crime no matter who they sell to. They're going to care less. If they're already committing a crime, they'll sell to minors. But once you legalize it, put it in the hands of a reputable dispensary who has regulations to meet. They have a professional sort of atmosphere that they have to adhere to. They're not going to be selling cannabis to minors. There are people that will share that perspective, and there are people that will also not share that perspective.
Right, and that's when I like to go to Colorado and the violent crime.
You like to cite, yeah, you can
So in the city of Denver, and I said this on the flag, I had the exact numbers in front of me, but when we looked at 2013 to 2014, which is fair, because Colorado legalized in the early 2000s, I want to say 2012. So giving it a full 2 years would be a great metric. Overall violent crime in Denver fell roughly 10%. Overall homicides fell, I want to say 56%.
Wow.
We saw these huge crime reductions in these areas, and can we say that marijuana caused that? No, you can't, because correlation isn't causation.
Right,
correlation. But what we can say is that there is no correlation with marijuana legalization and rising crime. We only see falling crime. We never see it go up. So I think that plays into the narrative. And I'm not talking, obviously, total arrest, because that statistic is going to be skewed. Because, of course, when marijuana is legalized, you're going to have a quarter less people arrested. But I want to look at violent crime, and you see the rates fall. Okay. You just see it fall. And this, to me, suggests that there might be something going on here. And again, I point to, I don't know a single person who gets high on marijuana and goes home and beats their kids. All right, I'm sure everyone across this country has heard of or personally knows someone who was a victim of domestic abuse because the husband or wife was a drunk who got handsy. And yet you never see that with marijuana. You just don't.
Right. You know, I tried to comment recently on a Facebook post by Valley News Live. It was about the legalization of cannabis, and basically what I tried to post was the biggest win of full legalization of cannabis would be that good people no longer have to spend time behind bars. They no longer have to spend time in prison. Your sons, your daughters, these people that you know are good people no longer have to spend time behind bars for a mistake or a life choice. And I proceeded to go on to say that beyond that, there are the economic ramifications of legalization of cannabis. Yeah. It is a no-brainer. I mean, we have so many things in this state, in this country, in this world that need money. They need money to show support, to get just a kick in the rear end to get going.
A boost.
They need a boost.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what
that's a perfect segue into my next point, which is agricultural revenues.
Okay.
So you can go aggressive on your estimates or conservative on your estimates. I'm going to give you both. That way the farmers who hear this, they can decide. But basically, our law allows unlimited outdoor grow. That means you can have one plant, you can have 1,000 plants, you have 10,000 plants, and that isn't unreasonable for a 200-acre farm. And the average farm in North Dakota, it fluctuates between 250 and 300 acres. But before legalization of marijuana right now, I remember when corn was $7.50 a bushel. Okay, and that was, I want to say 2008, 2009.
$7.50 or $750?
No, $7.50 a bushel.
Okay.
That's what I remember. And nowadays, we're talking $3.55 with spot at the end of January. It fluctuates a little bit. Mm-hmm. But we've seen corn crash, call it 50%. Okay, and these farmers are struggling, and their way of life is a little bit struggling too, because these small towns, they're built around the farming. For example, the town of Northwood has 28 sections of land, and probably 20 to 23 of them are being farmed. Okay, and when their revenues fall 50%, what do you think that does to the town that's built around those people? Well, it starts collapsing. The tax base falls apart, which means less money for the schools. The farmers ain't doing so good, so they don't go in and spend as much money in the town, and it hurts your town. So now we're circling back to my point. Well, what about marijuana? Well, a single pound of marijuana in Colorado, wholesale, so what the store pays before they put it on the shelf, is $1,000 for a pound. And let's assume you have a horrible year outdoor growing. You're not going to get less than about 8.5 ounces. off of a single plant. And that is horrible. That is a very low yield. Okay? You hear reports of all the way up to 3 pounds on a plant. But let's assume 8.5 ounces, okay? Because that way, sake of argument, it's a very low yield, okay? Let's also assume that you give each plant 4 square feet, okay? Because that's reasonable. It needs some space to grow out, to bush out, leaves, all that. So now we're talking roughly 10,000 plants on an acre, okay? And then from there, let's assume that, again, you have a fairly bad year, a bit of a blight, and only 60% of your crop goes to harvest, okay? You're still talking $3 million an acre, okay? If only 6% of your crop survives, you're talking $300,000 an acre. So you can literally plant an entire acre of marijuana, have less than 10% of it survive and make it to market, and still you're getting $300,000 an acre. And that means the state in tax revenue is getting roughly $24,000 an acre in tax revenue. You can fund the whole state budget with 6% of the farmland being used for marijuana. And those are not unrealistic numbers.
Wow.
If you assume the optimistic 3 pounds, 3 pounds per plant, 0% die-off, and that's not realistic, but this is the high end, you're talking anywhere 10 to 12 million.
Wow.
So
That's
under your worst circumstances, only 6% of your crop surviving, $300,000 an acre. And that builds you in a lot of cushion for if the price falls. Because people always say, well, Dave, that 3 million realistic number sounds great, but what happens when the prices crash? Okay, let's say the price crashed 90%, and let's use both numbers, the 300,000, which is very conservative, or the 3 million. So if the price crashed 90%, you'd be at 30,000 an acre, or 300,000 an acre, after a 90% price crash. Again, your range would be 30,000 to 300,000, depending on whether 6% of your crop survives or 60%.
Versus how much?
And let's put that into comparison for corn.
Yes.
So corn this year is projected to be 710 to 750 an acre. So that means 1 acre of marijuana is worth a little bit north of 40 acres of corn, absolute worst case. 90% price crash, 6% crop survival. If you have 60% crop survival, 1 acre of marijuana is worth 400. And if you have the most optimistic, that 3 million, it's worth 4,000. So 1 acre of pot could be worth more than the whole farm. Easily.
Wow.
In a realistic world, 1 acre of pot could be worth more than an entire farm. Because the average farm in North Dakota, like I said, is only 300 acres.
And that is good for who?
That's good for everybody.
That's good for everybody. Why? Tell me why it's good for everybody.
Remember how I said these small towns are built around the farmer? Okay? What happens when a school gets $24,000 an acre on multiple sections of land? You got a calculator on you. I don't. If you could pull that up real quick as I start talking, so we understand how much money we're talking about here. It's new schools. It's improving the roads. Right now, the state is having to levy all these special assessments because they can't afford to maintain the roads. Right now, they're doing all these things because they can't afford to do what they need to do because all the revenues are gone. And this is for a town the size of Northwood, which has 1,000 residents. The tax revenue from the farmland would be $288 million. Okay? To put that into perspective, the town of Northwood could literally write every single resident off that tax revenue a $288,000 check. That is the amount of money we're talking about here in tax revenue. In tax revenue. So your income tax, gone. Your property tax is going to go back down to where it should be instead of that ridiculous 50% increase we saw this last session. State budget crises, gone. Basically, all of this can be alleviated by these towns simply growing a reasonable amount of their farmland for marijuana.
Okay, I have a question. So far, I hear a lot of positives. I hear everything that's good. Everything that you're saying just totally makes all kinds of sense to me. My question, yes, exactly, that's your job. My question is, why has this not yet been implemented? Why is there so much hurdle in implementing this? Why isn't this a thing yet?
There's two real problems, okay? The first is social stigma. And so the social stigma is, if you use pot, you're a drug addict. If you use pot, you can't live a productive life.
Okay.
If you use pot, you're a degenerate. I hate to use the term because it's now a buzzword, but it's this belief that you're a degenerate, you're this miscreant, you're whatever. That's the belief. And that belief, unfortunately, perception becomes reality, so to speak. If people believe it, that's how they vote, and if that's how they're raised, that's what they assume is true.
Sure, yeah.
And the reality is the government for the past, call it 60 years, has been lying to basically everyone about marijuana. You and I remember it in the schools. We had that program, that stupid lion, the big fuzzy lion.
The scare tactics and stuff.
Yeah, and this is your brain on drugs, where they literally throw the egg into
the fryer.
The fryer, yeah. And that stuff changes perception. And when it's coming from a source that people trust, which is the government, I mean, people can say they don't trust the government. When you're a kid, you trust the government.
You trust what you see, yeah, right. And that's what you see.
And when you see that, it starts to become your reality.
Right.
And most people, thankfully, never interacted with people who really did drugs, okay? And there was always that one guy, and they attribute it to the pot. Well, the reality is the one guy you think of, the tweaking guy on the street corner homeless, he wasn't just on pot, he was on other things, but you didn't know that.
There's more to it than that.
Right, but that's what we now associate with pot, unfortunately. And that caused this reality, and it's about educating people. Because when you talk to a farmer and you tell them about that revenue, they start thinking about it. And then when you compare it to alcohol, they start thinking about it. As I like to say, it's all about risk versus reward. And are there some risks of marijuana use? Absolutely.
Of course, yes.
I'm not going to pretend there aren't.
Right.
But we allow alcohol. Okay? That is the maximum risk substance we as a society are currently allowing. We basically say alcohol is the peak risk we're willing to take. So if something falls below that risk, then intuitively people are going to say it's okay.
Okay.
The problem is this perception that it's this huge, monstrous risk above alcohol, when in reality, I believe it's less bad. And the last thing I want to say is we never used to know what the farm revenues were or the demand for this product was, because no one had taken that first step to legalize. Okay? When Colorado first legalized, nobody except for the large-scale drug dealers really knew what a pound of pot was worth. Okay, people kind of understood what a gram was worth, okay? But people didn't know what 1, 10, 100, 1,000 pounds of pot were worth and what the market would demand the prices. Well, we're 6 years into Colorado, okay? So now we kind of know what the market is. And now that we know what the market is, what we see is it's this fantastically large source of revenue. Because I can go and cite Colorado. Whereas before, if I had wanted to argue a pound of pot, I wouldn't have known. I couldn't have told you what the pound of pot was in 2011, 2010, 2009. Very few people in this country could have. But now that we have that Colorado source, I can show it to a farmer and say, here's what the price is in Colorado. Here is a real, fair estimate that's not from some sketchy guy. It's from the state.
The state. That's as I said, that's the biggest thing, The biggest win in this bill passing and staying the way you want is that we no longer have to put good people behind bars.
Oh, yeah.
And the economic ramifications. Yeah. Drug dealers no longer get rich. Instead, the state gets rich. And
mom and pop get rich.
Mom and pop, exactly. Mom and pop get rich, and the family people get to their taxes, their money gets put into things that family people want.
Right,
versus what drug dealers want, and that's exactly the thing.
Like I said, it's 1 acre of that pot on that $24,000 tax revenue. Okay, $24,000 is going to fund 2 kids going to school.
Sure.
Per town. That's what an acre of tax revenue funds, because the state spends anywhere from $10,000 to $12,000 a kid, depending on the year. Obviously, a little more if they're special needs. But 2 average kids, 1 acre of pot will send them to school. In perpetuity.
See, that's a weird statement to hear, because I'm imagining hearing this from my dad's perspective, from my mom's perspective, like hearing the things you're saying from my sister's perspective and other people's perspective that I know within the state, which kind of leaves me torn between this this perspective that I have versus the very Republican, very conservative stance that they have. And it's hard to reconcile. It's very hard to reconcile in some ways.
And I understand that. That's why I go through and very detailed where I'm getting my calculations. Like I said, for that 300,000 an acre number, I assume 6% of what you plant survives, and I assume you plant one seed every 4 square feet. And I use the Colorado-based numbers. Now, if you're a farmer that thinks 50% can survive, feel free to do your own calculations. But I assume, and I'm going to let them determine it for themselves, I assume 8.5 ounces per plant, 10,000 planted per acre, 6% survival rate to harvest, at $1,000 a pound. And anyone who disagrees with me, maybe you as a farmer think, well, I only think I can get 3% germination or survival after planting. And I don't think we'll hear a farmer say that, but if that's what you want to calculate, fine. And the tax I assumed is 8%. Because I realize people have write-offs, businesses have all these things, so I assumed an 8% effective tax rate on that ag income. If you pay more in taxes, then obviously you take the revenue per acre and multiply it by your tax rate. But I am as forthcoming as I can with these numbers, and I explain every line of it, so that way you can figure it out yourself. Because I've heard farmers say, well, Dave, I think I can get 50% of my crop to survive. Then they do the math and they figure it out on 50. Some people say, well, Dave, I feel that only 20% of the crop's going to survive, or I'm concerned about the growing season. I think only 1 in 2 years I'm going to get a good harvest. And then you can do it. You can look it up. The information's available to you. And come to your own conclusions. And nobody knows better than the individual farmer what their yield is per acre, what their land can do, and the survival rates from planting to harvest. And maybe I'm wrong, but in my experience, 6% is a very, very low survival rate.
Okay.
That would be considered horrible husbandry if we were talking corn.
Okay, sure. You know, while you were speaking, what I was imagining was like, you know, people I know within the state. Let's delve down their perspective, down their objections for a second. Like somebody who says, okay, what about, I've heard this, what about somebody who takes cannabis and drives behind the wheel?
Whoa. That is illegal. Driving under cannabis will be illegal in this bill.
It'll be driving while intoxicated.
And the question is, well, Dave, and I get this question a lot. Jay Thomas had this concern. A lot of great people have this concern. They say, Dave, I want to know a yes or no. Can you test someone in the field for if they're stoned or if they're high?
I hope so.
And the answer is there is a new strip coming out of Michigan that can do it.
Okay.
It's basically like a, you know those little Colgate strips you put on your tongue and they dissolve? Well, it'll be something like that. They'll put it on your tongue, they'll take it back off, and it'll change color if you've used marijuana because it traces the dye. I'm not going to get technical. I can provide the technical articles later. But it traces the saliva and the enzymes in the mouth to determine whether or not you've been smoking.
Perfect. So that should help reconcile the idea that people will be driving under the influence of cannabis.
Right, and that is a big objection. That's very fair.
Yeah,
I don't want people driving stoned either.
Exactly. Same thing for alcohol. You know, you don't want people driving out behind the wheel with.
Of course we don't.
Under the consumption of alcohol. Same with cannabis. Same with any drug.
Heck, it was a big problem for Emily when she was running for Congress here. That mistake. And that's one thing I want to go into. Look at how we treat Emily O'Brien, okay, who's now our state rep in District 42. And if you're listening to this, District 42 is the University District on Grand Forks. Okay. She was caught driving with a blood alcohol level north of 0.1.
No.
Now that is dangerous.
That's drunk.
Now if I can understand 0.081. Okay, that's
on the border.
That's a mistake.
Is technically legal drunk. 0.081 is
If it were 0.081, I'd say, well, maybe she had stayed in the bar another 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But when I hear north of 0.1, and it wasn't 0.10, it was 0.1 and some change. Okay. And yet she is allowed now to represent our district in the state legislature. But let's talk about what happens for a kid who's caught with 3 grams of pot, okay, on the university.
3 grams of pot being a small amount intended for personal consumption.
they're getting 30 days in jail. They're getting a huge fine. If they were actually on campus, they get a special kicker because they were within 1,000 feet of an educational institution. They're likely going away to prison. So the person who was literally driving and could have killed somebody got a slap on the wrist and is now able to represent the good people of Grand Forks. Whereas the person with 3 grams in their apartment harming nobody could serve years in prison.
That's a very bizarre way to see things. And what I want to do right now is take a second just to, I want to read a quote from an article titled A Brief History of the Drug War. And I found this article at drugpolicy.org. And it's a very interesting perspective as to what was going on, as to sort of the rationale behind making cannabis illegal, and the justification of what kind of sentencing cannabis will carry. So I'm going to just read this straight out of the article here. It says, in June 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs. He dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies, and he pushed through measures such as mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. A top Nixon aide, this is the interesting part here, a top Nixon aide named John Ehrlichman later admitted, this is a quote, John Ehrlichman, a Nixon aide, said this. He said, "You want to know what this was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and to associate blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both of those drugs heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So Nixon, at this point, temporarily placed marijuana in Schedule 1, which is where it still is today, which is the most restrictive category of drugs. So the reason I wanted to read that to you guys is because this speaks, it speaks to, it explains why cannabis is currently labeled Schedule 1, and it explains why cannabis has been vilified and demonized all these years. And it comes back to politics, and that's the way it's been for every drug in history. Crack, during the crack epidemic, crack and cocaine are they're the same drugs. They're cocaine, they're just in different forms. However, crack carries heavier penalties, heavier sentencing, because crack at that time was typically used by people in the ghetto, people that were black. And that is the root of all drug policy. It's political and racial. And today, the reason it remains, the reason that these drugs remain scheduled the way they are is because of finances. And probably still actually a little bit of politics is going on as well. Of course, I mean, it always is. I felt that was very important to pause the recording and put that in there just so you guys can get an understanding that drugs are demonized the way they are to obtain a political agenda, not based on the dangers of the drug. Cannabis isn't in Schedule 1 because it's a dangerous drug. Cannabis is in Schedule 1 so that Nixon could control politics. It's in Schedule 1 so that he could label cannabis users as felons, thereby taking away their rights to vote, thereby controlling their ability to participate in society, thereby controlling their influence on society, thereby labeling them as criminal and very useless, and then attaching a negative stigma of uselessness and just total denigration to that entire demographic. And I think this is a really good point to reiterate the fact that, I'm not condoning cannabis use. I'm not trying to say that there's no danger in cannabis. There absolutely can be. Any drug is dangerous. Like as I mentioned at the beginning of the radio show, abstinence is always the safest route for anybody to take when it comes to dangerous things such as drugs. And there's a lot of unknown as well about drug. There's a lot of interaction that can occur with medication. There are a lot of hurdles to overcome, but I think we need to reorganize the way that drugs are labeled. We need to reorganize the way they're scheduled, and we need to re-legislate some policy surrounding drugs. That's really what we need to do, because people are being negatively impacted by the laws that are currently in place. Arresting cannabis users is not getting society anywhere. It's not furthering our progress. It's actually inhibiting our progress. And for us as a whole, as a society, as a community, as a nation, to progress forward, we really need to take a second look at some of these drug policies, and we need to really analyze why these policies are in place. We need to consider whether they should be in place, how they should be changed, and that's what I'm here to do. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm subjecting myself to this very taboo topic. I'm putting myself on the line a little bit. My name is attached to this legal cannabis movement now, and it's scary. It's scary. I don't want to be labeled some quack. I don't want to be labeled a crackpot, but I believe in this. I believe that this is something that would be good for our entire community. So, yeah, let's go on. There's a little bit more of the interview left. Let's just go ahead and finish that up, and we'll have a few closing words.
Well, I'm not as educated in the history as you are. If you say that's the way it is, it is. But I want to make sure that people understand that opium is different.
Opium is bad. Yeah.
I don't like looping marijuana in the same category as those drugs. But
no, absolutely not.
That comes down to the Schedule 1 question. So,
yes,
marijuana is scheduled as Schedule 1, which means it has no medicinal benefit, which we know now is false. It has a high level of addiction, and it has a huge negative detriment on the health of the individual and the society.
That's both what Schedule of those things have been debunked.
That's what Schedule 1 is supposed to be, and I'd say none of those are true. And the problem is, let's imagine that you're a kid and you smoke marijuana for the first time and you learn it's not harmful. Okay? So, I see a list of Schedule 1 drugs. I see marijuana. I see methamphetamines. I see a couple others. Well, now my mind starts warping. What if they were lying about everything? Since I know pot is harmless, well, maybe this one's harmless too. Because my reality has been warped. Because something that should have never been in Schedule 1 is now in Schedule 1.
Exactly.
And so now we associate Schedule 1 with no real risk. So the person now sees, oh, well, marijuana wasn't that bad. Well, I've heard about this blah, blah, blah. And I don't want to say marijuana causes it, but they are interested in stimulants, let's say. And they see a friend who's using a Schedule 1, and cocaine is, I think, Schedule 2. Okay? So they see a Schedule 1 drug, marijuana, and they go, well, Schedule 1's worse than Schedule 2. And I've never done marijuana, but I want to do cocaine.
Yep.
And they go do cocaine, and they find out cocaine will kill you. Okay, if you do too much, your heart will stop. You will die. And you can die on cocaine. End of discussion. It's not hard to do. People do it all the time. You hear about it in Hollywood all the time. And it comes from this warped sense of, well, this must be less dangerous than marijuana because it's classified as less bad.
Yep. So I mean, most of my viewers, I think, that are listening today will remember the recent event at the Empire titled "The Opioid Epidemic," and where I shared an anecdote of my personal experience in which, I had been educated through the DARE program, and I took careful attention, and I would like to take that careful attention again today to commend the DARE program for trying to educate all of us consumers about drugs. However, the issue was the scare tactics that were involved. Marijuana was equated as this substance that you would consume and you would be rampant and crazy and wild, and you'd
on
kill
the floor
people.
Dead in 5 years.
Yeah, be all crazy, be on the dead, be dead on the floor in 5 years, exactly. And when you hear that about cocaine,
That's actually fairly true.
It's actually very true, especially in methamphetamine and opioids. And so, when I was young, I was 13, 14, and I had tried cannabis for the very first time, and I realized that this was not true about cannabis, and it really discredited everything that I had learned through the DARE program. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous because that's dangerous that cannabis was not accurate. In order to be credible, in order to impact lives most profoundly and in the best way, we have to be creditable. We have to be accurate. We have to make sure we communicate accurate information. And to say that cannabis is going to cause people to become crazy and harm others and do very reckless and stupid things is simply not accurate. And when I consumed marijuana for the first time, I realized that that was not true, and I questioned the validity of the DARE program related to other substances such as heroin. And that's kind of one aspect of how I landed myself into my opioid addiction. And my viewers and I have sort of a relationship about my opioid addiction. I've spoken out about it several times. I was an intravenous opioid addict.
Ooh, yeah. IVs. So
yeah, IV.
You were probably getting them through hospitals then.
No, I was one of the people that were not. I know a large percentage of people do start at first with a legitimate prescription, but I was not one of those people. I experimented with drugs. Experimented with all kinds of drugs. And I would not have done that, though, if I had known that what DARE told me about heroin
was correct.
Was true. Yeah, it was correct. What DARE told me about heroin was real.
Yeah.
They told me the truth about heroin. But I didn't believe them because they told me a lie about cannabis.
Yeah, heroin will put you out colder than a banker's heart. Marijuana, not so much. Yeah. Heroin, I don't wish heroin on anybody.
Right, yeah, it was very bad. And it was just very destructive to my life. And that's why I value your presence here today, having this conversation. Yeah. I'm so grateful to be able to share, especially this, that a drug is not the same as another drug. It is not the same as another drug. Each drug is unique. Each drug has its own addiction profile. Each drug is very different from another drug. You can't just blanket statement everything and say that everything is dangerous. Every drug is bad. You can't just say that. It's not accurate. Yeah. It's not right.
And I'd like to say that probably half of all Americans are addicted to caffeine.
Yes, that's very true.
Caffeine, arguably, is all upside, no downside. And that goes back to your point. And I'm not saying treat marijuana like caffeine. I'm saying compare it to alcohol. I think alcohol is fair. But I think that's a fair baseline. And I really don't like what they're doing because marijuana is a depressant. And when, again, heroin used to be Schedule II. I don't know what it's still at because heroin used to be used in British medical hospitals. It used to be used in the U.S. It's not anymore, thank God. But heroin was Schedule II for a long time.
Heroin's Schedule I now, I believe.
Thankfully.
Yeah.
But for the longest time, for the older folks listening to this show who were in their 40s and 50s, there was a time where the government said heroin is safer than pot.
Okay. How does that... well, yeah, okay. So they thought that. That's what they thought at the time, and now...
Well, the reason heroin used to be Schedule II is its chemical form is called diamorphine. It is the pure form that they use in hospitals. And you can't prescribe someone something Schedule I in a hospital. Mm-hmm. You can't.
Because there's no medicinal application.
And so diamorphine or dimorphine was always used because it was a super effective version of morphine. It was essentially seen as double morphine. That's not what dimorphine means from a chemistry perspective, but it was essentially stronger than morphine. So they'd give it to soldiers who got wounded in Korea, or they'd give it to people to knock out their pain. Because if there's one thing heroin is good at, it's making you not feel pain.
Yeah.
And since it was used in hospitals in a very, very controlled way, it had to be Schedule II.
Okay.
So for the longest time, people were told heroin is safer than marijuana. And that's the absurdity of it all.
I mean, drugs...
It's sad is what it is.
Yeah, geez. Morphine was used as cocaine, rather, was used as a cure for morphine addiction. Or maybe it's that morphine was used as a cure for cocaine addiction. And, the point is that this whole progression of drug ideology and drug laws. So far, it's been a huge experiment.
It's an experiment that's failed.
Yeah.
And we need to focus less on making people second-class citizens and more on rehabilitating them.
Yeah, there you go, yeah. The biggest win.
The reality is we spend right now roughly $45,000 a person to put a stoner in prison, when I would much rather him go to his workplace the next day and be productive.
That was an impressive statistic that you shared. I remember you shared that, and I was so impressed. $45,000 per person. Per year. To incarcerate a person for 1 year for using cannabis.
Yeah, that is the net economic impact on that person.
Yeah, and my viewers will remember that I was an opioid addict, and I could have very easily been in prison. Yeah. And here I am with this enormous drive to give back. I'm getting educated, I'm getting trained with skills, and I have this enormous drive. I want to give back to the community for giving me my sobriety and caring about me and the people that cared about me in society. They helped me. And now I want to give back to you. And I think that is what every addict...
Yeah, plus you're being a good, I wouldn't say father, but you're being a good role model to these two kids. You're going to school, you're making something of yourself.
Yeah, I'm a role model to kids.
And think about, and people don't understand this about people who are popped for marijuana, and this is why expungement is so key in our bill, because we have expungement now. Because under the old bill, when you applied, under the law as it is now, when you're released from prison, okay, and I want to be clear, our bill doesn't release anybody early, it doesn't commute sentences, it doesn't stop people from facing the charges and facing the music if they were convicted before the date of this passage, or if they were arrested before the day of this passage. If you're arrested on November 1st, you will still have to go to trial and face the consequences as though you'd done it under the old law and serve your full term. Okay. And if you're currently in prison, you have to serve your full term. But when people come out, they can't get federal financial aid. They can't get student loans through banks. Whenever they apply for anything, jobs most of the time, they can't get a decent job because they're a felon. Can't go to tech school because they're a felon. So these kids now are coming out, and it's mostly kids. I think it's fair to say most marijuana first-time offenders are in their 20s. Mm-hmm. They're coming out of prison, and now they have no way to ever better themselves and be a productive member of society. You're creating buckets instead of allowing these people to be a faucet. And what I mean by faucet versus bucket is I have to fill a bucket with water from somewhere else, which means that they have to net take. Whereas a faucet supplies water to others and net gives. And that's why expungement is so key, because we want these people, after they're out of prison for marijuana, to be able to turn into a faucet and not be locked into being a bucket for society.
Yeah. Give resources, don't take them, and that's what we need to aim to do. We need to aim to equip people to provide back, and this is the only way. Part of me wants to apologize to the viewers and say, I'm sorry to put you through this rigorous thought experiment, but really this is necessary. It's necessary for all of us to consider these points. Like, these are very important points, and they are so deeply rooted in our experiences. Like, we need to address these topics. We really, really do. This is something that is here. It's going to be on the 2019 ballot. We have 2018 ballot. We have to address this. I mean, this is the time, and I hope that we can all agree or disagree. Call in, disagree, send me an email, and
we'd love to do a live show where I just field questions from y'all.
We should do a live show. We've been talking about that on the radio station. We haven't actually done a live show yet. And that is something I've heard many people say that we need to do, because they want the debate. They want the back and forth. And, you heard me earlier in the show trying to kind of be the devil's advocate. Right. And I want to include you viewers as the devil's advocate. I want to address your questions, and I want to answer them, and I want to let Dave answer them. I want to let anybody who can answer these questions. We just, the point is that we need to talk about it. Whether we agree about it or not, let's at least talk about it. Okay?
And one thing I'd like to pitch, by the way, before we get too late on time, is I'd like to make sure people know where they can go to find out more about us and sign the petition.
Yes.
So there are 2 Facebook groups. One is our just Facebook page, Legalize ND, and that's just for people to follow the campaign, get news. One is the ND Legalization Initiative group. It's got about 1.5% of the North Dakota electorate in it. Proud of that statistic now.
All right.
And that's for people who are interested in volunteering. And for everybody, check out our website, legalizend.com. And if you get a good response from your viewers and you get a bunch of questions, I can guarantee that I can come back and we can answer all those questions line by line and do that. I'd love to do that, and I think your viewers would love to do that as well. But anything else that we didn't hit?
I think we did a lot. We got a lot here. We got 43 minutes. I just want to say I appreciate your time so much. I
love getting an opportunity to be in front of the media.
Absolutely. What a great time.
I'm just happy this one isn't a camera.
Yeah. So what I want to go ahead and do now is just remind the listeners that the views and opinions expressed in this week's episode of the Harm Reduction Report do not reflect the views and opinions of the radio station or anyone affiliated with the radio station. They're simply the views and opinions that Dave and I hold. All right, everybody. So that about wraps it up for this week's episode of the Harm Reduction Report. Just a couple of quick things. I think for next week, I am going to try and do a before and after interview, a before treatment and after treatment interview of an individual I know, and sort of assess his fears and his reluctance going into treatment and some of the things he's encountering, and then do a follow-up report of what he actually experienced during treatment. If we can't make that happen, if that doesn't pan out, then another option for next week's episode as of right now is related to Medicaid issues. There are currently Medicaid issues sweeping the nation, and people are having a very difficult time gaining access and maintaining their Suboxone support. And this is happening right in the middle of an opioid epidemic. So I have a couple of interviews lined up for that topic. And, you know, that's a big deal. It's only going to make the opioid epidemic worse. So I'm thinking about diving deeper into those issues with you guys if I can, if everything pans out. But I think that about covers it for now. Until next time, you know, I hope I didn't offend anybody too drastically this week. I know it was a very controversial topic. And I want to just thank the listeners again for bearing with me and tuning in. And, you know, I want to thank you for your patience and your open-mindedness and willingness to consider different perspectives. It's a great opportunity to be able to be here speaking with you guys, and I hope we can tackle these issues together. I hope we can find the solution. So yeah, that covers it. Until next time, your pal Cal signing off. Everybody have a good day. Thanks. Bye.